Although the Ethiopia of today is in a shameful and sorry state, we can reminisce over a beautiful time period of organic revolutionaries exerting the will of the people in the 1974 Ethiopian Revolution, which would ultimately culminate to the rule of Mengistu Haile Mariam. Although leaving the country battered after Western-backed rebels took over the country and destroyed it through decades of civil war, the effects of the Ethiopian Revolution are of great benefit ultimately, and to the Ethiopian people it should be held with pride. Despite seeming spontaneous after the 1973 famine, the Ethiopian Revolution represented more than 2 centuries of buildup, marred with ethnic supremacy, religious division, and gross effects of absolutist power. This video, just to note, is not going to go over the full rule of the socialist Derg, instead just reviewing the build-up, execution, and some of the effects of the Ethiopian Derg, especially under Mengistu Haile Mariam. The story of Ethiopia and its revolution doesn't begin with the 1973 famine, the Italian invasion, or even Haile Selassie's reign itself. It actually starts with the reign of Emperor Menelik II. His reign was in the middle of the scramble for Africa, and because of this, he was under constant threat from European powers for Ethiopia's subjugation. Instead of taking an oblivion turn with European diplomacy, Menelik would famously collaborate with the Europeans to instead forge an Ethiopian empire at the same time. Starting from simply the highlands of today Amhara and Tigray regions, what would later be called the Menelikian expansions would almost triple the size of Ethiopia, from simply administering less than a dozen ethnic groups to exerting control of almost 100 as it has today. The unique ethnic element of the Ethiopian Revolution would have its seed planted during the reign of Menelik II. Ethiopian subjugation would only be cemented after Ethiopia's victory in the Battle of Adwa. While an important victory for Pan-Africanism in the African diaspora worldwide, the intrigue behind the battle would signal to future Ethiopian emperors that the previous form of imperial decentralization that was very adamant and historic to Ethiopia could not work in the modern age, and that a more absolutist turn would have to be taken. These sentiments come about because of the huge conversation between many Ethiopian regional kings about collaboration with both the British and Italian empires, something which had a long possibility due to the nature of the shogunate-esque Ethiopia, which only recently exited from. And due to Menelik's expansions, groups like the Oromo, Somali, and Omo peoples, and dozens of others were incorporated into the empire with brutality that is still remembered today. While the next 2 imperial rulers, Iyasu V and Zewditi I, would continue Menelik's policy of benign neglect for the peoples of the south, simply using them for wealth extraction as people they could tax, the critical lack of literacy in these places restricted the establishments of major works of literature and national awakenings that we would see with, for example, the Lithuanian people in the Lithuanian National Awakening. Cultural output that would create pride for various cultures in these areas would never really be established due to the empire's lack of literacy, something which would be flipped on its upside when literacy was given to these people, which was only done by the Derg. This ethnic equilibrium of peace, as I was saying before with Menelik, Zewditu, and Iyasu, with the Amhara and other Abashite groups on top, would see its foundations crushed during the reign of Haile Selassie.
They must do something about it. If government was not prepared to give it to them, then I feel it's only human to reach and get it.
Maybe the most famous emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie enjoys many honors. For one, he led an independent black nation at a time when there were far and few. Another, he was integral to the creation of the Organization of African Unity, having its capital based in Addis Ababa. Also, the very famous religion of Rastafari is based around the life of Selassie. But the much beloved emperor only enjoys these honors across the world, because within Ethiopia the story is much more different. While he was the regent and emperor of Ethiopia at the time before the Italian invasion, Haile Selassie would embark on many tours and sponsor modernization within Ethiopia. While seen as a part of a deep history of 19th century modernizing leaders in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa in general, Haile Selassie took a distinct turn when he rejected the previous policies of Ethiopian ethno-pluralism. While ethno-pluralism in the Ethiopian sense was still very oppressive, especially for the mainly southern and Muslim peoples, Haile Selassie took a very radical turn, especially after his restoration in 1943 during and after the Second World War. The already powerful Ethiopian Orthodox Church would be cemented as an institution within the country and be given vast tracts of land, and many students and officers would be sent around the world for teaching in order to return these gifts back to Ethiopia. One of these officers would be a certain Mengistu Haile Mariam. But the most damaging action done by Haile Selassie was his policies of ethnic centralization. He would ban other languages such as the Oromo language, and he would promote Amharic language as a social requirement in the country. He would also promote Amhara settlers to take up land in the rich and fertile southern areas. This disruption of agriculture all over the country would be the empire's demise, as the country was already known for chronic drought. Furthermore, the influence of capitalism within the country, only brought with the distinct entrance of Ethiopia into modernity, was what made many farms switch from traditional subsistence agriculture to farming for cash crops like cotton or coffee at the behest of these landlords. These increased exports would go straight to the pockets of the emperor and the newfound industrial oligarch class, and most of this money would be reinvested strictly into the capital, Addis Ababa. The highly stratified Ethiopian society, stratified from ethnicity and class, never had a unified banner to march under, until that dark specter shrouded Ethiopia for the first time. That dark specter was communism. Before we can speak on the effects of socialism and what it had on the revolution in 1974, we must first analyze the various factions of Ethiopian socialism. Prior to the Derg, the leftist movement in Ethiopia only had support from students and trade unionists, due to the fact that trade union workers and students were part of a new and growing middle class that were able to be put in contact with students abroad who had ample exposure to Marxism and other banned leftist literature in Ethiopia. While many organizations sprung about, there are two that are the most important. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, known as the EPRP, or the Amharic adjective of Ihapa, and the All-Ethiopian Socialist Movement, or Meson as I will call it from now on. Because of the most prevalent strand of socialism at the time, Marxism-Leninism, most of these socialist parties would toe the USSR party line. But in essence, the most prevalent reason why these parties advocated for socialism in the first place was to answer the distinct question of Ethiopia, which was the question of nation. Like stated before, Ethiopia by the 60s and 70s was nothing more than an amalgamation of different ethnic groups, many of which would never call themselves Ethiopian until decades prior. Because of this and the growing exposure to the various national liberation movements growing across the world and in history, there were many calls to formulate a response to this growing sense of nationalism felt by many ethnic groups concentrated in the south, but also the new Ethiopian acquisition of the colony of Eritrea after the Second World War. So, after socialism was presented as the answer to these questions, the support for these groups surged. Although starting as small student groups, organizations such as the EPRP and Meson were met with support from the peasantry, as the new rallying calls would be, even today, the most famous and prevalent slogans of Ethiopian politics. As stated before, socialism was presented as the answer to the conditions and questions brought about by the conquests of Menelik II, and also the apartheid system brought about by Haile Selassie and the cultural repression that was taking place as well during his reign. And so, the slogans in Amharic were Merit ለአራሹ and ብሔረሰቦች እኩል ናቸው. Respectively, these slogans mean land to the tiller and nations are equal. Slogans like these could only be conceived due to the rapid rise of socialism and leftism being aware in Ethiopia. Calls for land reform were always shouted in the country, but in the context of Ethiopia, radical land reform, like statements like land to the tiller, and demands for the recognition of the dozens of ethnic groups in Ethiopia as equal and valued members of the country, represent a dynamic shift in the politics of Ethiopia. No longer were quiet queries and askings tolerated. The Ethiopian people knew they and they only could change the situation Ethiopia faced. Now, since we have an understanding of both origins of the revolution and the various strands of socialism present in Ethiopia at the time, we can ascertain the direct catalyst of the revolution in Ethiopia. Without a doubt, the Ethiopia we see today would not exist without the sheer incompetence of Emperor Haile Selassie in the light of the 1973 famine, which gripped the country in poverty and malnutrition. You see, the agricultural policies stated, such as the slave like conditions of many Ethiopian farmers, the rapid change towards cash crops, and the archaic farming method, especially towards food production, all contributed to the crescendo of disaster that faced Ethiopia in 1973. Due to his pro-Western policies, Imperial Ethiopia developed a strong reliance on British and American aid, and due to the world oil crisis of the time, many of the normal aid that Ethiopia would receive was cut off at this time of worldwide austerity in the capitalist sphere. Like I said with my videos on Everydays, first world support of African countries were the only things prolonging the existence of terrible regimes such as Bokassa in the Central African Republic, Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, and finally here with Haile Selassie's Ethiopia. Almost always, after the aid dries up, the people themselves in these countries take power. Not taking a hint after the oil crisis and famine, Haile Selassie would famously embark on a lavish celebration in his personal home in front of the millions of his oppressed denizens. And on September 12th, the day after the Ethiopian New Year, Haile Selassie was deposed, ending a 3,000-year monarchy. But this is not the end of the revolution, simply the start. In a last-ditch effort to save Ethiopia in the light of economic collapse, drought, and the reaction to the stark racism in Ethiopia, a provisional council was assembled of generals. This was known as the First Ethiopian Derg, or military government. The first iteration of the Derg was famously filled with high-ranking officers and imperial favorites. Its head, Haman Andom, an Eritrean general, would be known within the country for his actions on the Ethiopian-Somali border, attempting to go so far as to provoke war with the neighboring country. The jingoistic general would be put as the head of the new junta, following the resignation of the entire imperial government. Attempting to portray himself as a progressive strongman, taking influence from both Bolivar and Nasser respectively, he believes in healthy cooperation with both Eritrea and Ethiopia and attempted to cool down the ongoing conflict, a conflict only caused by Haile Selassie severing the province of Eritrea's autonomy in 1961. But because of this, he gained the spite of many hardliners in the military council and was soon ousted and executed by his opponents after a shootout. The man who replaced him, Tafari Benti, was also an Ethiopian Unitarian, in the sense of viewing Ethiopia centralized by not the Amhara ethnic group, but by ideology. Tafari would go on to create a united front of all the political groupings of the country, from both the EDU, the Ethiopian Democratic Union, which is a neo-monarchist party, and both wings of the civilian left in Ethiopia, the EPRP and Meson. This noble attempt of unity would fall flat on its feet, as infighting with these groups would dissolve the legitimacy of Tafari in his right to rule, and a certain Mengistu Haile Mariam would see himself rise to the top as the de facto leader of the country. What is important to know, however, is that the first two Dergs of Haman Andom and Tafari Benti would both recognize Haile Selassie's son as the nominal leader of the country and as a king who had a legitimate claim and right to rule. This is why the monarchist and socialist coalition fell apart as well. Dialectically in the situation, socialism and a feudal monarchy could not exist with one another, and soon enough, Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam would attempt to solve this contradiction. The period of extreme intrigue in the light of post-imperial Ethiopia was to be put at ease once Mengistu Haile Mariam took power. A socialist himself, he led the socialist wing of the Derg. You see, the way the Derg worked was it was a council of military officers, where each branch of the Ethiopian military would send delegations. The army, police, border guard, etc. would all send delegates to the 120-man council. Mengistu, a part of the young officers, would see famine support from the people themselves within the Derg and the people of Ethiopia themselves. So naturally, Mengistu Haile Mariam would take power with the support of the young officers after Teferi Benti lost power and grace. He would soon start land to the tiller programs or the Merit al-Arashu programs that were very famous and popular among the peasants in Ethiopia, and he would set up peasant cooperatives for agriculture. I find the narrative from both the left and right wing that Mengistu was an aloof military general, when this could not be further from the truth. He was actually down with the people, toiling for their livelihoods every day. Mengistu would also call for the nationalization of the business and banking sector, directing their output for the people, and soon enough urban unions were formed and empowered. These unions were called qabiles. Both peasant cooperatives and qabiles would have elected leaders whose representatives would be sent towards the bureaucratic apparatuses that would pertain to these people. This was by far the most democratic form of governance that Ethiopia has ever faced, and it will likely be the only democratic government that Ethiopia ever had. He would restrict housing for a natural one house per family policy, ending the extreme housing ownership that was faced in Imperial Ethiopia, and he would tackle the homelessness and poverty problem Ethiopia had in her cities, something we can desperately see a need for today in both the United States and Ethiopia. And maybe his most important law were his literacy reforms. Even as a socialist government, UNESCO would famously applaud it. A great paper on the Ethiopian literacy programs is titled An Appraisal for the Literacy Campaign in Ethiopia During the Military Regime by Garma Amare, where he highlights the increased literacy from 7% to an incredible 70% by the late 80s, which lands Ethiopia as one of the most literate, underdeveloped countries on earth at the time. This would also be recognized as the biggest social spending of the regime. The democratic, educational, and economic reforms brought about by Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia in stark contrast to the repressive system we have today marred by ethnic conflict, which was brought about by the largest opposition group in Ethiopia, the nascent EPRDF and the TPLF. And on the question of ethnic treatment in Mengistu's Ethiopia, we also see another contrast of the first two Dergs, who maintained the policy of Amhara dominance by both maintaining the ban of the various southern languages and also keeping the institution of the Ethiopian monarchy in general. No longer was it a crime to speak any other language than the Amharic language in Mengistu's Ethiopia, and the social taboos of even admitting one's ethnicity that differentiated from the Amhara one was quickly shed away in Mengistu's Ethiopia. We can now see that more and more Ethiopians in general reminisce over the rule of the Derg, and not just old people like post-Soviet Russia and Eastern Europe, but the spirit of Mengistu's Derg truly lives with the younger generations of Ethiopia, and this block of people in the incredibly young country of modern Ethiopia begin to vote and sense the deep problems with the current system of the country will soon face the sentiments that many Ethiopians also feel, that Mengistu Haile Mariam and his rule was a hero and the revolution was a needed institution for Ethiopia. Mengistu Jegna, and thank you for watching.